My name is Evan Marks. For 8 years, I was the face behind the record sales of Tech Solutions, a mid-sized software firm based in Denver. When I first joined, the company was bleeding clients, barely scraping by with outdated products and zero reputation in the industry. I didn't come in waving a flashy MBA or some grand vision. I came in with a Rolodex of real relationships, a stubborn work ethic, and a commitment to solving problems personally. I met clients where they were, whether that meant flying out on red ice to fix issues no one else would touch, or spending weekends helping their teams transition to our platforms. In my third year, we broke the company's all-time sales record. In my fourth, we doubled it. By my eighth, I was personally responsible for nearly 40% of Tech's total annual revenue. My team trusted me. Clients trusted me. Even the old CEO, Mr. Douglas, a grizzled veteran of the tech wars, trusted me enough to leave me alone to do my work without interference. Everything changed when Mr. Douglas retired and the board brought in a new CEO, a slick, polished figurehead named Chase Randall, fresh off a failed disruption stint at a Silicon Valley startup no one remembered anymore. He was all style, no substance, sharp suits, buzzword meetings, endless talk about pivoting to a subscription-based cloud-first synergy model without once asking what our clients actually wanted. I kept my head down and kept delivering, thinking results would speak louder than buzzwords. I was wrong. The first time I met Chase properly, he called me into his glass-walled office. Without looking up from his tablet, he said, "Evan, love the passion, but we need to move past relationship selling. It's inefficient. We need scalable funnels and digital acquisition strategies." He didn't ask how we were breaking sales records. He didn't ask how clients like Marlin Systems and Black Peak Innovations renewed multi-million-dollar contracts year after year, personally requesting me. He didn't care. 2 months later, he reorganized the sales team, cutting personal client managers and implementing a new account optimization platform that no client wanted or understood. I watched loyal clients grow frustrated as their calls were routed through automated systems instead of getting a familiar voice. Complaints piled up. Meanwhile, I kept working the old way in the cracks of a new system, salvaging relationships, apologizing for the changes I had made. I thought if I could just buy us time, Chase would realize the importance of what we had. I underestimated how deeply he'd bought into his own fantasy. One Monday morning, while finalizing a renewal for a 7-figure deal with Marlin Systems, I got the email, mandatory meeting, executive conference room, 10 a.m. I knew. Everyone knew. You can smell these things. I sat through 10 minutes of Chase talking about strategic realignment before he slid the termination letter across the table. Effective immediately. "Thank you for your contributions," he said with the detached tone of someone discarding a worn-out piece of furniture. Human resources watched silently from a corner. I didn't argue. I shook hands mechanically, gathered my things into a single box, family photos, awards, handwritten client notes, and walked out through the lobby where I'd once closed the biggest deal in company history. 8 years, reduced to 15 minutes. No one said goodbye. No one dared. I sat in my car in the parking garage, hands frozen on the steering wheel. My phone buzzed repeatedly. Clients, co-workers, even a few board members. The news traveled faster than I could think. I didn't answer any calls. I drove home, the Colorado skyline shrinking in my rearview mirror. At home, my wife Amanda hugged me without saying anything. My daughter Mia, too young to understand, babbled happily about her day at preschool. I smiled for her, but inside, everything cracked open. For 8 years, Tech had been my life. And just like that, it wasn't. The next morning, I woke up early out of habit. I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, staring at the blank page. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want drama. I wanted to work to build again. But I couldn't shake the knowledge that my departure wasn't just personal. Chase didn't understand what he'd dismantled. And soon he would. At 9:15 a.m., my phone rang. It was Lena from Marlin Systems. Her voice was tense. "Evan, we just got an email from Tech about new account strategies. You're not there anymore, are you?" I confirmed. Silence stretched for a beat. Then, quietly, she said, "Our renewal's up next month. We were only staying because of you. She didn't threaten. She didn't make demands. She just stated a fact. I thanked her for calling, hung up, and scribbled Marlin Systems, loyalty uncertain on the pad. Before noon, I had 6 more calls. Black Peak Innovations, Zenith Solutions, Verity Data Corp, Horizon Systems, all asking the same questions. Where was I? What happened? Could they still trust TrianTech without me? I answered honestly but cautiously, respecting my severance agreement. I wasn't about to give Chase the lawsuit he probably hoped to file against me. By the 3rd day, Chase called. I didn't answer. He emailed. I didn't reply. His messages grew increasingly urgent. Critical client retention concern. Need your insight. Requesting immediate discussion regarding transitions. The man who hadn't valued a single real relationship now needed the one thing he couldn't automate: trust. I leaned back in my chair, feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Control. They'd taken my job, but they couldn't take what I'd built inside people's hearts. Not with apps, not with automated emails, not with self-important strategy decks. Later that week, a small consulting firm I'd worked with years ago reached out. They needed help advising mid-sized tech companies on client retention and expansion strategies. It wasn't flashy, but it was real. It was a start. I accepted a short-term contract. 2 days into it, I got another call, this time from another old client, offering not just work but investment if I ever wanted to launch something bigger. For the first time since being fired, I let the idea settle in my mind. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe it was the start of something they could never replicate. Something human. Something real. As I sat there making notes, another email pinged into my inbox. It was from an internal contact at TrianTech, an old friend who hadn't dared to call me. The subject line was short. Thought you should see this. Attached was a confidential presentation, Chase's grand new strategy rollout. The slides showed revenue projections, assuming 95% client retention despite cutting personal account management. A transition to automated services. Price increases across the board for premium support. They actually believed clients wouldn't mind losing the people who knew them best. They thought loyalty lived in logos, not relationships. They were wrong. And the next quarter was about to prove it. The weeks that followed unfolded like a slow, inevitable landslide. TrianTech's quarterly earnings call was scheduled for mid-May, and whispers from former colleagues trickled in long before the official numbers hit. Panic was spreading behind those polished glass doors. Clients who had once accepted minor hiccups out of goodwill were now scrutinizing every delay, every mistake, every impersonal interaction. Without the quiet interventions that people like me used to perform instinctively, late-night calls, personal visits, hand-delivered apologies. The small cracks widened into gaping fractures. Clients didn't care about buzzwords or digital-first roadmaps. They cared that no one remembered the particular licensing exceptions they'd negotiated years ago. They cared that when technical issues arose, no one picked up the phone to calm them before frustration boiled into anger. Most of all, they cared that the human beings they trusted had been replaced with a platform and a ticketing system. I kept my distance, focused on my new consulting assignments, but the messages kept coming. Lena from Marlin Systems confirmed that they decided not to renew their contract with TrianTech. A major loss. Shortly after, Black Peak Innovations followed suit, citing leadership instability and degradation of client services in their formal termination letter. It wasn't just the big accounts. Mid-sized clients that the executive team had considered low-hanging fruit were walking too, unwilling to tolerate the downgrade in treatment. Each departure was like a small tear, and the fabric was unraveling faster than they could stitch it back. 3 weeks after my termination, I met quietly with 2 former colleagues, Trevor and Naomi, at a coffee shop across town. Both had been reassigned to new roles under Chase's system, stripped of autonomy, buried under metrics that didn't mean anything in the real world. They confirmed that internal morale was at a breaking point. Quotas were missed. Staff meetings grew heated. Longtime employees who had once taken pride in solving client problems were now reduced to logging data points in dashboards no one checked. Naomi confided that the board was growing nervous. Word had leaked that Chase's promised efficiency gains had not only failed to materialize, but costs had risen due to the endless hiring of consultants to paper over the growing client dissatisfaction. The final insult was that despite all the chaos, Chase refused to accept any blame, instead pushing mid-level managers into resignations to create scapegoats. The decay was systemic, and it was accelerating. By the time TrianTech's quarterly report was published, it was worse than anyone had predicted. Revenue had dropped 22% from the previous quarter, a staggering collapse for a company that had projected 15% growth. Several major accounts had formally defected, naming lack of relationship continuity as the primary cause. Chase hosted a frantic all-hands meeting, insisting that the downturn was a temporary realignment issue and that new digital acquisition campaigns would more than make up the difference. But behind the scenes, the knives are already out. Board members who had championed Chase's appointment were quietly distancing themselves. Investors began questioning whether the leadership team understood the nature of their own business. Stockholders lost confidence. Even employees who had initially embraced the digital-first vision were now realizing they were standing on the deck of a sinking ship. Through it all, I stayed outwardly quiet. I made no public statements. I didn't post passive-aggressive LinkedIn updates or leak insider information to reporters. I worked. My small consulting portfolio grew faster than I could have imagined. Companies that still valued relationship-driven growth sought me out. My phone rang with opportunity after opportunity. There was no website for my consultancy yet, no formal marketing, just word of mouth spreading from clients who trusted that I understood what others had forgotten. People do business with people, not platforms. I started sketching out a bigger plan, a vision that went beyond just consulting. I envisioned a firm built on the foundations that had once made TrianTech great before they forgot themselves. Deep client relationships, accountability, and a culture that valued people over processes. Not a revenge move, a rebirth. One evening in June, as the sun dipped behind the Rockies, I received a text from an unknown number. It was brief, almost desperate in its simplicity. "We need to talk. Chase." I stared at it for a long time without replying. In the following days, more formal communications arrived. First, an email from TrianTech's HR director, inviting me to participate in an advisory discussion regarding client retention strategies. Then a certified letter offering me a 6-month consulting contract with an exorbitant hourly rate, clearly intended to buy my silence and my help in salvaging the mess Chase had created. It would have been easy money, a payday for a few months of cleanup work. But it didn't sit right. They didn't want my insight. They wanted a Band-Aid for a wound that was still growing. They hadn't changed their philosophy, only their desperation level. Meanwhile, a former client, Horizon Systems, reached out through back channels. Their CEO, Elena Foster, proposed something audacious, partnering with me to build a specialized client services firm, one that would act as an extension of tech companies' customer relationships, without replacing the human connection that made those relationships valuable. Elena offered seed funding, office space, and an initial roster of clients ready to sign. It was a risk, but it was the kind of risk that built legacies, not just bank balances. I said yes. Quietly, carefully, we began assembling a team. I reached out to former TrianTech employees who had been let go or had resigned in frustration. Many jumped at the chance to join something real again. Within 6 weeks, we had an office, a name, Harbor Point Solutions, and a charter based entirely around relationship-driven service models. No buzzwords, no fake innovation, just honest, skilled people doing what they did best, connecting. Meanwhile, TrianTech's situation deteriorated further. Anonymous reviews flooded job boards, painting a grim picture of life inside the company. Client trust metrics, once the crown jewel of our quarterly reports, nosedived. Several clients banded together, threatening lawsuits over breach of service-level agreements, citing the removal of dedicated account managers as a violation of contract terms. Chase responded by firing the VP of Sales and 2 regional directors, hoping to shift the blame. But by then, the rot was too deep. The company's value proposition had collapsed from the inside out, and no rebranding campaign could hide it. In late July, just as Harbor Point officially launched its website, a major tech news outlet published a damning expose detailing TrianTech's internal chaos. Former employees spoke anonymously about the culture of fear and data obsession. Clients went on record complaining about broken promises and impersonal service. The piece quoted multiple sources describing how the company's downfall began almost immediately after sidelining its top relationship builders. My name wasn't mentioned explicitly, but the implication was clear. Chase had fired the one person who understood the fragile web of trust that held everything together. And the cost was becoming public. I didn't celebrate. There was nothing satisfying about watching something I had poured years of my life into collapse. But there was a quiet, undeniable satisfaction in knowing I had built something new, something stronger, while they scrambled to explain away their failure. One evening, as I locked up the new office after a long day, I paused and looked around. Laughter drifted from the break room, where some of the team was finishing up a brainstorm session. It felt familiar but better. No glossy marketing slogans. No hollow mission statements. Just people who believed in what they were building. For the first time in months, I felt peace. What I didn't know yet was that the real reckoning hadn't even started. August brought a sharp, sudden acceleration to TrianTech's unraveling. It started quietly, almost invisibly, as key vendors began hesitating to renew contracts. Then came the larger cracks, with two critical software partners pulling out of multi-year agreements, citing concerns about operational continuity. The internal leadership, desperate to plug the holes, scrambled to renegotiate terms at steep discounts, but the damage was already done. TrianTech's reputation, once built painstakingly over years of relationships and reliability, had turned toxic in a matter of months. Clients whispered about it to each other at conferences. Industry forums buzzed with warnings cloaked in professional language, but unmistakable in their meaning. A giant, once stable, was listing hard toward capsizing. Harbor Point, meanwhile, was gathering momentum like a well-built ship catching a favorable wind. Our emphasis on personal service, client-specific strategies, and respect for long-term needs resonated loudly in a market now starving for authenticity. Clients who had once signed multi-million-dollar agreements with TrianTech without blinking were now wary of flashy promises and eager to work with partners who valued substance over sparkle. Every week, more inquiries arrived in my inbox. Former contacts, newly independent tech entrepreneurs, even competitors quietly seeking advice. They weren't chasing better pricing. They were chasing trust. And we had IT.by mid-August. TrianTech's board had convened 2 emergency meetings in less than 10 days. Sources inside the company leaked that the primary agenda wasn't how to fix operations. It was whether Chase Randall's leadership was salvageable at all. Some factions argued he needed more time. Others, growing louder, insisted that a change had to come before the next earnings cycle or the firm wouldn't survive the winter. Investors began demanding explanations. Stock analysts downgraded TrianTech's outlook from stable to high risk. Employees polished resumes in the middle of meetings. Managers began ghosting internal check-ins, quietly interviewing at rival firms. It wasn't just a leadership crisis anymore. It was a systemic collapse of confidence, a slow-motion freefall disguised only by corporate euphemisms. And through it all, Chase remained oblivious, insisting that if everyone just stuck to the new processes, the numbers would recover. He truly believed that replacing trust with efficiency was a math problem that could eventually solve itself. In early September, Chase made a final, desperate move. He announced, with great fanfare, the acquisition of a small AI analytics startup, touting it as proof of TrianTech's innovative future. Internally, however, it was an open secret that the acquisition was rushed, overvalued, and utterly disconnected from the company's immediate survival problems. Clients didn't need predictive behavior modeling. They needed someone to answer their calls and solve their problems today. The announcement backfired spectacularly. Key clients, already on the fence, interpreted it as proof that TrianTech had lost touch with reality. Two of the top 5 contracts, Verity Data Corp and Crescent Industries, announced immediate termination of their agreements, choosing to absorb the financial penalties rather than risk another quarter of service degradation. The stock price, already fragile, dropped another 14% in a single day. Industry news outlets pounced. Analysts published brutal opinion pieces titled "The Death of Relationship Business," how TrianTech forgot its soul, and "Chasing Efficiency, Losing Clients. The Case of TrianTech's Collapse." At Harbor Point, we moved carefully, deliberately, not trying to capitalize on TrianTech's fall, but focusing instead on delivering results to our growing client base. We hosted our first client summit, an intimate 2-day event emphasizing shared learning, open dialogue, and long-term partnership building. No glitzy keynote speeches, no overhyped product launches, just real people talking about real problems and real solutions. The contrast with the sterile, corporate conventions of companies like TrianTech couldn't have been more stark. Our clients noticed. They talked. They brought friends from other companies to see what we were doing. By the end of September, our client retention rate was an unprecedented 98%, and new business inquiries were up 60% over projections. What we were proving, quietly but undeniably, was that the old principles weren't dead. They were more valuable than ever. Then, in late September, the final blow landed. A class action lawsuit, filed by a coalition of former clients, accused TrianTech of breach of contract, deceptive business practices, and negligence. The lawsuit specifically cited the elimination of dedicated account managers as a material breach of service agreements, and included damning internal emails showing that leadership had knowingly misrepresented service capabilities during contract negotiations. It was brutal, public, and impossible to spin. Within 48 hours, major media outlets picked up the story. Board members who had once defended Chase began leaking their own frustrations to journalists, painting him as a reckless opportunist who never understood the company's core strengths. Investors fled. Competitors circled like sharks. Recruiters openly poached TrianTech employees on professional networks. In less than 6 months, Chase had taken a thriving, respected mid-sized powerhouse and driven it into existential crisis. One cool October evening, after a long day at Harbor Point, I sat alone in my office, reviewing onboarding documents for 3 new clients who had officially signed contracts earlier that afternoon. My phone buzzed. It was a private number. I let it ring. It rang again and again. Finally, curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up. A quiet voice, strained but familiar, filled the line. It was Chase. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He asked if we could meet. Urgently. Privately. No lawyers. No contracts. He just needed to talk. I listened in silence, feeling no anger, no satisfaction, just a kind of distant pity. He was drowning, and he was reaching for the only person he thought might still know where the lifeboats were. I told him I was busy, which wasn't a lie, and hung up without making any promises. He never called again. The next day, the news broke that Chase Randall had resigned, effective immediately, citing personal reasons. The board issued a terse statement thanking him for his service and promising a strategic review of operations. No grand farewell, no tribute videos, just a footnote, a failed experiment quickly buried in the relentless churn of business news. By the end of the month, TrianTech's headquarters, once bustling with energy, operated on a skeletal staff. Entire floors were empty, desks abandoned. The heart of the company, the relationships, the pride, the human engine that once drove everything, was gone, and no algorithm in the world could bring it back. At Harbor Point, life moved forward. We expanded cautiously, staying true to the principles that had guided our formation. Trust earned, not demanded. Problems solved before escalation. Relationships nurtured, not harvested. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was real. It mattered. One afternoon, as I walked through our open plan office, listening to the murmur of collaboration and laughter, I realized something simple and profound. Getting fired was the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because it had hurt, but because it had freed me to build something that could truly last. And this time, no one could take it away. The final chapter of TrianTech's downfall didn't happen with an explosion. It happened with silence, with meetings that weren't scheduled, with emails that went unanswered, with partners that simply stopped returning calls. By November, the board had installed an interim CEO, an internal finance executive whose mandate was simple: stabilize the brand if possible, sell the pieces if not. Inside sources confirmed that bankruptcy was quietly being discussed as a contingency plan, but the real damage was already irreversible. TrianTech had bled out in the one place it couldn't survive: its reputation. Clients had moved on. Vendors had shifted loyalties. Former employees had found homes at competitors, or, in many cases, joined HarborPoint's growing team. The market had spoken long before any official filing would ever acknowledge it. What stunned many observers was how quickly it all collapsed. Companies usually rot over years. TrianTech had unraveled in less than a year after abandoning the one principle that had made it special: real relationships, nurtured by real people who cared about more than quarterly metrics. It turned out that all the dashboards, analytics, and scalable platforms in the world couldn't replicate the simple act of showing up when it mattered. And when clients realized the soul was gone, they took their loyalty elsewhere without fanfare. HarborPoint thrived quietly during these months. We avoided the temptation to gloat or advertise ourselves as the anti-TrianTech. We stayed focused on service, on delivering on promises, on exceeding expectations not with grand gestures, but with small, consistent acts of reliability. Our team grew naturally, not from aggressive recruiting, but from the gravitational pull of people who still believed in doing business the right way. By December, we had expanded into a second floor of our building. New client contracts arrived weekly, not because of splashy marketing, but because someone a client trusted had whispered our name over coffee or dinner. Our referral rate was over 70%, an unheard of figure in the tech services space. Revenue projections for the year had to be adjusted upward twice. It wasn't a storybook rise. It was careful, deliberate, and quietly revolutionary in an industry that had convinced itself relationships didn't matter anymore. We knew better. In early January, a former TrianTech board member reached out discreetly. The message was simple: would I be interested in discussing a possible acquisition of TrianTech's remaining client contracts and service assets? They framed it as an opportunity to reintegrate key client portfolios under trusted stewardship. I read the message twice before setting it aside. There was a certain poetry in it. The same people who had once dismissed relationship-driven leadership as outdated were now asking the man they discarded to pick up the broken pieces. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel angry. Mostly, I felt a deep, unwavering certainty that HarborPoint didn't need to buy what TrianTech had destroyed. We didn't need their tarnished contracts or their damaged reputation. We were building something cleaner, something stronger, something that had never compromised itself chasing the wrong things. Politely, I declined. Our growth would come the hard way, the real way, brick by brick, handshake by handshake. I never heard back from them again, and I didn't need to. In February, the final announcement came. TrianTech would be acquired by a private equity group specializing in distressed assets. A polite euphemism for a corporate salvage operation. They would strip what little was left of value: intellectual property, proprietary tools, small clusters of remaining loyal clients, and discard the rest. The TrianTech name would continue on paper for a while, perhaps slapped onto generic service offerings. But the spirit, the legacy, the soul of the company I had once fought for was gone forever. Not because the market changed, not because the industry evolved, but because leaders forgot that at the heart of every business transaction, there are people trusting you to care. At HarborPoint, we marked the moment quietly. No celebrations, no champagne. Just another day helping clients, solving problems, building something that would last. In March, we finalized our employee ownership program, giving every full-time team member equity in the company they were helping to build. When we announced it at an all-hands meeting, there was no thunderous applause, just a quiet, powerful sense of pride filling the room. People leaned forward in their chairs, smiled at each other, understood that they weren't just working for a paycheck. They were building a legacy together, one client at a time, one promise at a time. On a rainy Sunday afternoon that spring, I drove past the old TriTech building. It was still there, a gleaming glass and steel tower surrounded by empty parking lots. A leasing sign hung crookedly on the front lawn, advertising premium office space available immediately. I parked across the street for a few minutes, engine idling, watching the wind whip through the barren courtyard where once employees had gathered for celebrations, where clients had arrived smiling to renew contracts. It looked the same, but it wasn't. The life inside it had long since moved on, and so had I. As the rain thickened, blurring the building into a shapeless mass through my windshield, I smiled softly to myself. Getting fired had been the hardest moment of my professional life, but it had also been the catalyst that forced me to remember who I really was, what really mattered. Relationships over transactions, people over platforms, substance over spin. TriTech had forgotten, and the market had reminded them, harshly and without mercy. Harbor Point hadn't set out to replace them. We had simply set out to remember what they had forgotten. And in doing so, we had built something that could endure storms far worse than a quarterly dip or a flashy new competitor. We had built trust. As I pulled back onto the road, leaving the empty building behind, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not triumphant, not victorious, just grateful. Grateful for every late-night phone call, every early morning client visit, every tough conversation that built a bridge instead of burning one. Grateful even for Chase Randall and the short-sighted board that let him tear down what we had built. Without them, I might never have found the courage to start over, to build something cleaner, stronger, real. Somewhere in the distance, the rain was clearing, and ahead, the road was wide open.